Hi, Adam.
Oh, oh, uh, hey, hi, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm good.
Oh,
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Pleasure to meet you at last after after all this time. Managed to sync up. Yeah, time zones are a bit of a problem for me. I'm not very good with numbers, so but I'm glad we finally managed to meet up. How are you?
I'm good.
Awesome.
Yeah, I have a little bit of trouble hearing you. I think there's just buzzing or maybe just low audio.
Oh yes, yes. I think I need to get a new cable or something. Is the volume still okay?
Yeah, no, I can still hear you. That's okay.
Yeah. Is the buzzing sound a bit too off-putting, or is it okay?
No, that's fine. I was just for the recording, but it's all good.
Yeah. Yeah.
No
Yeah. I'll
worries.
have to update my sound card or my cables or something. But yeah, it's a pleasure to finally meet you.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you know, I'm part of the wild animal suffering focus group, herbivorous predators, and
hmm
we started a series of interviews. Well, my third one so far was that I did Andres first, who kindly recommended me uh, to interview you, and then David Pierce. So I've been just very interested in your thoughts, and I read your article and I found it very interesting, and I made lots of notes and questions. I wondered if you wanted to introduce yourself at all, or just tell viewers a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, sure. I'm Jeremy Hadfield. I'm a student at Dartmouth College. I study philosophy and cognitive science with a focus area in computational consciousness.
Yeah.
So um, yeah, I study. I think a lot about the imagination, about the future, about um, the future of computation and
Right.
of consciousness. And I worked for the Qualia Research Institute for about a year as an intern and volunteer.
Mm.
And so there I did a lot of work on the symmetry theory of valence, um, which is an idea about how suffering happens and how joy happens in the human brain and in conscious systems more generally. And there I also met David Pierce and many other people, and that's how I was sort of introduced to the ideas of effective altruism and of wild animal ethics and um, long-termism, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one thing I found really interesting and engaging with uh, the futurism and transhumanism and suffering abolitionism. Is what you've got all these different focus groups. You've got effective altruism, you've got human suffering, and non-human suffering, and all. What I found most compelling about it is that it's an all-encompassing uh, uh, human endeavor, really, because everyone suffers, everything suffers, and I believe every um, field, discipline of science, study, philosophy, and inquiry has something to offer, and the
Right.
the fight against suffering or the fight to liberate ourselves from suffering. Um, yeah, that's interesting. How did you acquire your internship? Did you know Andres already, or is this something you were hoping you planned to do for a while?
Yeah, I heard about QRI from some friends.
Hmm.
I like most of them were in the Harvard Psychedelic Society, and they told me about QRI, and I started reading a lot about it. And then I had a friend here who did an internship there, and then I met with Andres, and I met with Mike Johnson and the other founders. And after that, I just sort of applied, sent them some more details, and talked to them, and then I was in the first class of interns, which was like 10 other people.
Hmm. And do you enjoy it? Did you have lots of fulfilling experiences and learning new things there?
Yeah,
Brilliant.
it was definitely the best internship I've ever done. I
Yeah.
thought it was super. It like changed the way I think a lot.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, I think we're witnessing a renaissance in psychedelia now, and I think people are starting to move past the stigma a little bit. I mean, uh, obviously in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, were thought, people were about to make some great breakthroughs, and then of course they were regulated or outlawed, and then I think we've come back round again to finally unlocking their true potential in therapeutics and PTSD and such, I think.
Right.
Are you still studying at the moment?
Yeah, I graduate this term, so I graduate in about 2 months.
Oh, congratulations!
Yeah. So that's why I've been in, job interviews, stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic! And how did it go? Did you get the job?
I don't know if I got the job yet. I still have more rounds to go, but it went well. And
brilliant!
I'm still going.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are a lot of cards on the table right now. I guess I won't know what I'm doing after graduation for a little bit more, which is, kind of, it makes me kind of nervous, but I think eventually it'll be okay. It'll all turn out well.
Yeah, definitely. Are you in where are you now? Are you in Hawaii?
No, I don't know. I'm very far from Hawaii, unfortunately. I'm in New Hampshire.
Okay. Cool.
I'm like an hour and a half from Boston. I'm in Hanover, New Hampshire.
Okay. Yeah. Oh yeah. Just so you know, we can always edit out bits of like personal information or anecdotes that might want including in the final version, of course. So yeah, that's no problem.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. I would say for me, David Pearce is the main figurehead within suffering abolitionism that I most align with. That's him and Andres. And I see people like Andres as a kind of like David is passing the baton to Andres, and I like Andres's ideas on psychedelia, and I'm also very 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 fond of his creative endeavors with smell, with fragrance.
Yeah,
so that's something I think has been unfortunately forgotten about within art and aesthetics and creativity. And it's mostly audio-visual now, I think. But yeah, so I mean that's very kind of avant-garde.
Right.
You see, yeah, your Nietzsche article. I've always found the paradoxes within suffering abolitionism, whether philosophical or practical or both, to be most compelling and interesting. So, of course, we have the hedonic treadmill, for example, and the paradox of hedonism, also known as the pleasure paradox. And another aspect to suffering abolitionism that's riddled with paradoxes is, I suppose we're talking quite very, very far into the future, is what to do about suffering in the past, or time traveling into the past on a rescue mission to solve past suffering.
Yeah.
Of course, the mercy of temporal paradoxes in particular, and then you've got the multiverse problem. I wonder if suffering is something that we can ever truly free ourselves and living things from, or will it always be like an unreachable goal? I wonder.
Yeah, no, that is a great question, and all of these. There are so many paradoxes within just happiness in general. Like you were saying, there's the paradox of like pursuing happiness or pursuing any sort of hedonic value or reward often undermines that reward. Pursuing happiness directly, personally, I've noticed that seems to reduce the reward or reduce happiness. And just more generally, that's something that people notice. But like, I guess what I'm focusing fundamentally on in this paper or this essay is a paradox that Nietzsche sort of brings out. And that's the suffering abolition paradox, that it seems that in the process of trying to abolish suffering, which is, David's goal. David is a suffering abolitionist, David Pearce. And Andres is also mostly a suffering abolitionist. So this like project of suffering abolitionism, I worry, and Nietzsche's worry is that in the process of abolishing suffering, we eliminate our ability to make suffering meaningful. And we also may end up reproducing suffering or causing more suffering in the process. And fundamentally that happens because, first of all, you point out that like there are many parts of this project that seem fundamentally unfeasible. So for example, like how are we going to go back in time and resolve previous suffering? How do we go to other like branches of the multiverse and resolve suffering there? What if most of the suffering in the universe is fundamentally inaccessible to us and maybe unknowable? And I think that these, furthermore, even the project of like eliminating suffering from just Earth's biosphere, trying to like reduce suffering in the natural world, reduce suffering in human life. I think that project of reducing suffering is definitely laudable and important and the most essential ethical obligation, probably. But I think the project of eliminating suffering entirely is not the same and leads us, I think, into some very bad sort of ethical territory where people essentially are dreaming. Nietzsche calls this afterworldliness. And afterworldliness,
I like it.
Yeah, afterworldliness, he criticizes it a lot in the context of Christianity, because Christians, he says, often have an ideal of the afterworld, and that afterworld allows them to essentially not think about the present and to justify their suffering in the present by dreaming of an afterworld or a heaven. And in heaven, suffering would be eliminated, justice would be present, and so we don't need to strive for justice on earth. We don't need to strive for happiness on earth, fundamentally because heaven is there. And of course, Christianity doesn't necessarily imply that, but even in forms of Christianity where life on earth still matters, fundamentally, life on earth is less real and less important than life after earth. And so he calls Christianity a nihilistic religion, and it's nihilistic because it negates life, it negates human life, and it negates life on earth. And so my worry is that, and I bring this out in the essay, one of my worries is that because suffering abolitionism may be fundamentally unfeasible and may also distract from like the real suffering that is present in everyday life, that is not this sort of global version of, for example, suffering in the animal world. It may distract from that, and it may also negate it and tell us that like what will redeem all suffering is only this final point. These, like, for example, Andres and David sometimes call it like, I think the phrase is like infinite gradations of bliss or something like that.
Gradients, information sensitive gradients of bliss. Yeah. Right.
Information sensitive gradients of bliss. And so information sensitive gradients of bliss, I think that Nietzsche and a lot of Nietzscheans and just general critics of afterworldliness would see that as a form of afterworldliness, because it's a dream. It's a dream of a future where there is no real path to that future. It doesn't necessarily imply a lot of like concrete actions. There's not a super strong practical theory of how it can be achieved or what it would constitute. And so it just becomes a form of like imagining a heaven and then saying that this heaven justifies suffering, but doesn't really justify the suffering. I don't think it's meant to justify the suffering, but I think that it functions to sort of, it functions as a kind of afterworldliness. Does that make sense? What was your response to that?
I must thank you for introducing me to a new word, afterworldliness. As a writer and a budding wordsmith, I do relish encountering new words. Definitely. It sometimes feels like people do bury their head in the sand, and so they're waiting for like a savior or a messiah so much that they miss worldly suffering on one's own doorstep. And I think there is lots to tackle here and now, lots of all terrible forms of human suffering, but we don't want to kind of like use resources upon thinking about too far ahead in the future when there's lots of work still left to be done here, I think. And it always reminds me of that Nikola Tesla quote who said, man-made horrors beyond our comprehension, and I certainly don't want to end up creating more of those kinds of horrors, because even though we're trying to kind of engineer horror out. And I do wonder if we know enough about animal cognition yet to tackle the biosphere and to become competent stewards of it, or even plant cognition as well. I think people. I mean, that's something that might need to be considered at some point as well. Do plants suffer? And then I think sometimes this is why people have to be careful when entering suffering abolitionism, because if they're sensitive, it can send them on a bit of a downward spiral, because you feel as a species we're making progress in one area, and then another thing pops up, and then another thing. I remember the paradox being likened to you have to wait like a cat. You have to wait for the cat to approach you and rub its leg on you, otherwise you'll run away if you try and catch it. And I remember something interesting about I think the metaphor stamp collecting in terms of pleasure was used. Stamp collecting, the person who collects stamps does it because they like to collect stamps, not because they're necessarily looking for pleasure. Because if they do it that way, then it becomes less pleasurable. It's very frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we can change direction and look to the future as well, or bi-directional in terms of eternity. Can we rescue an unfortunate being from eternal suffering, like someone like Prometheus or Faust or Sisyphus? Those concepts like infinity and eternity worry me, because somewhere in the multiverse is there a being that always has been suffering and will continue to suffer forevermore? I wonder. And then, because of course, at any point within an eternity, there will be an infinitely long time before, as well as an infinitely long time to come. No matter where in eternity you pick a spot on the timeline. So, I mean, paradoxes are fun to try and use as a thought experiment, but they do have some horrific implications.
Right. Yeah, I think that potentially hedonism gets you into a lot of paradoxes. I think hedonism as an ethics is sort of difficult to reconcile.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't consider myself a hedonist. And
quite wise, I think, not to. Yeah.
So I think that so first of all, to define the terms so that a hedonist would accept my definition of what I'm criticizing. I think a hedonist is fundamentally someone who views the fundamental moral value as increasing the experience of pleasure and reducing the experience of pain. So what matters is hedonic value or pleasure or happiness. And David is a negative utilitarian, so that what matters more is suffering. Suffering has more moral weight than pleasure. So but first we should eliminate suffering. And that's a hedonistic imperative, right? Is to eliminate suffering so that all may experience, fundamental positive experience. And I think that's true. And I also think that there's fundamentally something true that the origin of all moral value does seem to be experience. And positive experience is unquestionably better than negative experience. And like Nietzsche, I think one of the points of my essay too here was to argue that Nietzsche is more of a hedonist than many people paint him as. He's not like a person who thinks that suffering is just a good thing. He thinks that joy is necessarily good. He thinks that joy essentially, what proves that joy is good is that the experience of joy causes us to want more joy, while suffering flees itself. So there's this sort of phenomenological evidence at the level of experience. Everyone intuitively knows that suffering is bad. And I think that most moral systems obscure that, and you can get caught up in abstractions. I think, for example, a lot of deontological systems get caught up in abstractions about duty and about necessary features of the human subject, when in reality they're also about suffering and joy, or suffering and happiness, but they've forgotten it or obscured it. So, but my criticism of hedonism is that, first of all, there are a lot of thought experiments that I think show the cracks of just maximizing for one value. So maximizing for example, minimizing suffering or maximizing positive experience, for example, means that you have to do a lot of very difficult calculations that can lead to things that seem clearly morally wrong, and also just seem to maximize for the wrong thing. So for instance, if someone had let's say there's someone who suffers dramatically more than any other person, does that mean that in order, for example, let's say there's someone who has cluster headaches, and let's say they have the worst cluster headaches on the planet. Let's say they experience cluster headaches at a level that is just let's say it's 1,000,000 times worse than going through birth, going through labor. That means that it would justify essentially millions of other people forgoing basic happiness in order to let's say that this person, in order to treat him there was like an incredibly expensive drug. This thought experiment is a little bit unrealistic. But let's say there was let's say it's unrealistic, but it's plausible enough that it's possible. Let's say that in order to like save this person from this extraordinary suffering of cluster headaches, we needed to spend like an exorbitant amount of money to develop a very like powerful but expensive drug. And in order to do that, we essentially had to like take away resources from literally millions of people. And I think that there is sort of a value, not just to suffering, like the raw quantity of suffering and the raw quantity of happiness, but also to the particular form that happiness comes in. And I also think that meaning fundamentally matters often more than pleasure and pain.
I agree.
And I think that like that's an important, like humans have this ability to narrativize suffering and to make suffering meaningful, to the point where we don't really disvalue suffering as much as we sometimes think we do. Like Nietzsche points out that really what we disvalue is not suffering, but meaningless suffering. Suffering that does not seem to have any meaning.
Needless.
And needless, meaningless.
Absolutely.
And so I think that means that hedonism's flaw fundamentally is that it's a maximizing system for a single quantity, and it's quantity focused, and it's not fundamentally respecting of the form of that the suffering takes, or the form that the happiness takes, whether it's meaningful or not, how it's distributed across a lifetime, whether that suffering is like the property of a human being or a person or not. And it also means that, for example, like Andres even thinks this, I think, that like humans should be replaced with hedonium, which is just a substance that experiences positive, emotion all the time.
Hedonium shockwave,
right, or like a hedonium shockwave could just consume the universe. And I think that like to ridicule that is bad because it like shows a lack of understanding. I think there is like maybe it's plausible that there would be very high moral value to a universe made of hedonium, and I don't want to just make the argument of like speciesism, like, oh, but don't we want humans around because I'm a human? But I do think that it's kind of absurd to think about moral value or about value in general in the absence of the only beings who are capable of attributing value that we know of, which are humans. And not only that, but like, just like this idea of hedonium, it's sufficiently abstract and it's sufficiently distant and sufficiently impossible that I think it's essentially like just not, it's an afterworld. It's an afterworld to me. But similar to heaven, similar to infinite gradients of superhuman bliss.
Right. Yeah, that's something I noticed missing as well. Like in the community, the suffering abolitionism community, I think we could say there's almost an over reliance on the pain pleasure axis when there are other things to consider as well, like meaningfulness and meaninglessness as well. And I think within philosophy as well. I think, you're right. Hedonism has become a bit of a loaded word now, and I think in philosophy they tried to nuance it by attributing sex, drug, and rock and roll to just folk hedonism, when you've got these other more refined kinds of hedonism. But I think, no matter how much, no matter which way people use it, I think it conjures up certain images in people's minds that aren't particularly helpful. Because they'll just think of like the base desires and things.
Right.
And it was certainly when you were talking about like the calculus, it reminded me of Yudkowsky and Less Wrong, and reading about torturing one person because getting billions of people getting dust back in their eye is worse. It's very counterintuitive scenarios, really. Would you mind explaining the symmetry theory of valence? Because I think I got the wrong idea. I thought it was maybe like pain and pleasure are mirror opposites, but I don't think that's what it is it? I think.
So the symmetry theory of valence is a theory about how valence occurs in information systems. So valence is, pain or pleasure, positive experience, negative experience. And so the symmetry theory of valence argues that, and this is the technical version of it that they often say, is that the degree of positive valence in a system is proportional to the amount of symmetry in the mathematical object that is isomorphic to the information system. So that means that, so for example, by isomorphic, we mean like analogous or of the same structure or like simulating the system. So let's say we create a mathematical model of the human brain, and that mathematical model is very accurate. It captures the dynamics of the human brain perfectly and simplifies them into a mathematical model. And mathematical models have a property, many of them have a property of symmetry. Whether there are many different kinds of symmetry. There's like visual symmetry, there's temporal symmetry or symmetry over time. There's different kinds of visual symmetry, like you can have symmetry like this, of just like, two hands. You can have symmetry like this. You can have diagonal symmetry. You can have all these different wallpaper symmetries. So symmetry is sort of a underdefined term, and there are many different kinds of symmetry. But fundamentally, it means is that the more joyful system will be the one that has more symmetry in its mathematical model. And so if you look at the human brain, we do kind of see this. There is sort of empirical evidence that leads us to believe this. And this is actually what I was working on when I was an intern there, is researching empirical evidence for the symmetry theory of valence. Some examples of this are that often the brain states that are associated with higher like pleasure or higher happiness are more symmetrical. So often, on the other hand, suffering is associated with an actual imbalance in brain activity. So for example, it will be hemispherically imbalanced. It'll have like, or even in sound, for example, music that has more symmetrical properties will produce higher valence. Art that is more symmetrical often produces higher valence. We find people who are more attractive, if they're more symmetrical, we often find people more attractive. We find buildings that are highly like non-symmetrical are often seen as less beautiful. So this is not universally true, but there seems to be a lot of circumstantial evidence that potentially symmetry is an important factor in experience. And that raises the question of like, why is symmetry seen? Why is it pleasurable? And there are different explanations for this in affective neuroscience, or like the study of how emotion and like happiness, stuff like that, occurs in the brain. And the most dominant theory of this is they're essentially computationalist theories, which means that they focus on just like essentially the functional structure of the brain, how like information patterns occur in the brain. And they argue that the reason why, for example, more symmetrical people or more symmetrical artworks are more like produce more positive experiences is because of a combination of cultural like layering, like cultural experience, that we are conditioned to believe that symmetry is more beautiful. But that plays less of a role than that. The brain is fundamentally a machine for modeling the world. And if an object is more symmetrical, it's much easier to model, because all you have to do is sample a small piece of it, and you can just assume what the rest of the piece is because it's all symmetrical, for example. And that essentially just creates a very easy to simplify and model system. And it's very like fluid for perception. And the brain experiences like good predictions as positive or as rewards. So there's a whole theory of suffering, that suffering is fundamentally a prediction error. That the brain essentially is always predicting what rewards it will get from things. And when it predicts that you will receive a high reward from something and you receive a lower reward, then the difference between those two is suffering. So suffering is not exactly just like pain as such, but it's the difference between the pain you expected or the reward you expected and the reality. And so, like, why symmetry will result in very high pleasure, essentially, one theory is that it's just very easy to predict, it's very easy to model, it's very easy to perceive. And so the brain just like that results in the experience of a positive emotion. But that is not QRI's theory. So QRI tries to criticize that sort of consensus.
It has, you say so?
Yeah.
Okay.
QI, I mean, I think that is sort of on to the right track. And that's like essentially the main theory that has been accepted by a lot of academic neuroscientists. And so that's the theory that the Quality Research Institute has to confront mostly. And I don't think it's settled. I don't think the debate is settled at all. Like, I don't think that QI has like the nail in the coffin. But its idea is that, first of all, the brain is not just an information system. So like, it's not just some pattern of information that's passed around that can be realized in any physical system, or any physical substrate, from silicon to carbon to, I don't know, hydrogen. Like, the brain is actually the physical properties of the brain matter a lot for QI. And so it's a physicalist. The QI theory of mind, sort of like the main theory of mind, is physicalist. And Andreas argues for this by arguing that for qualia computing, that essentially experience arises from physical properties of the entire brain, especially things like the electromagnetic pattern of activity across the entire brain, and things like connectome specific harmonic waves, which are like just waves of sort of electrical activity that sort of wash over the brain. And these are what result in positive experience, and they cannot easily be realized in any other physical substrate. Anyway, this is all very complicated, and I'm simplifying a lot, but the main idea is that symmetry produces positive experience. So it's an empirical theory about how suffering arises, but it leads to a lot of like ethical and philosophical conclusions. So for example, for Andres, it means that what matters is that we should try to maximize symmetry in a lot of different systems. And we can essentially, I guess the dream is that we no longer would have to rely on theorizing for ethics. We could rely on a very like almost a mathematical property. So it would be like a mathematically grounded ethics, because if it is the case that positive experience of all kinds is produced by symmetry, and positive experience is the only ethical quality that matters, then all that matters is just maximizing symmetry, right? And trying to reduce dissonance or noise or these things that destroy symmetry.
So that could potentially pave the way for a new kind of philosophic calculus, perhaps.
Right. Yeah.
Cool. When you said suffering is or could be a prediction error, it reminded me of what you want and having what you want can be vastly different and can be separated by a goal sometimes. Interesting about symmetry, because personally for me, aesthetically, in my mind, I find asymmetry to a degree, not chaotic, but I do find asymmetry quite aesthetically compelling. But I suppose it's not one. Yeah, I definitely did get the wrong idea about what the symmetry theory was, but no, that was fantastic.
No, I think that's a good point, is that like it's actually not clear at all. Like, I framed it as if it was clear that like more symmetrical things are more positive or more beautiful. But if you look at the empirical evidence and like if you really dig into the literature, which was what I was doing as an intern a lot, it's actually not that clear. It's not settled at all. People do find asymmetrical things very like beautiful very often. And you know, for human faces, that might be different because there's a lot of evolutionary signaling there too. Because often, and for like other things, maybe symmetry matters more, but it's not like a domain general, like the main thing that makes something beautiful is symmetry.
Right. Oh, okay.
But I do think that in general, it does still play a really important role. And very often the kinds of asymmetry that people find beautiful, the reason why they find them beautiful is because they're sort of principled breaks of symmetry, or breaks of symmetry that preserve a higher order kind of symmetry. And there's also like a lot of reasons to believe in this come from psychedelics, because psychedelics produce this positive experience that is almost impossible to conceptualize outside of them. And they also produce kinds of experience that are difficult to conceptualize. And Andres, I think some of his motivations for this theory, and he's sort of like one of the main people along with Mike Johnson, who develops the theory of the symmetry theory of valence. And he noticed that on DMT and very high dose LSD and just other like very powerful experiences on psychedelics, he started to notice just layered patterns of symmetry, and like just incredible amounts of complicated but beautiful symmetry. And the more symmetrical the experience was, the more positive he found it. And the same thing can sort of occur for meditation. And
wow.
I think he found that in his own experience, just like the more he focused on it and focused his awareness, he found that symmetry of all kinds was just associated with a positive experience.
Wow, that's fantastic. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Oh, that was on DMT, was it?
Yeah, that's on DMT, 5-MeO DMT, some other substances.
Wow, that is very interesting. Yeah, I remember lots of with like tryptamines and things, lots of kind of video feedback effects, like when you connect a camera to television and you hold the camera in front of the screen, you got sort of video feedback, and reminds me of some of Douglas Hofstadter's work.
Yeah.
What would the empirical evidence come in the form as? Is it ECGs, brain scans, or?
That is a great question. I'll start answering, but I'm gonna pull up my doc where I did all this research because I kind of want to see that. I want to see my old stuff as well. But yeah, a lot of it would come in the form of EEGs. Yes, like EEGs have a sort of simple way to evaluate symmetry, and a lot of current neuroscience research is done on EEGs, which I actually think is like sort of a major problem, because EEGs are very low resolution, and so like in order for neuroscience to really make progress, I think it has to surpass EEGs. Yeah. But yeah, that is one thing that we have. But other things that we found, like Sean McGowan, who was another intern, worked a lot on affective blunting, which is sort of just the experience of suffering and pain being reduced, but also joy and happiness being reduced.
Affective, so this happens.
Affective blunting.
Oh, affective blunting. Thank you.
Right. So like emotional blunting. And this happens. This is essentially QRI's theory. It explains a lot about how things work, how drugs work in the brain once you understand the symmetry theory of valence. Because, for example, SSRIs or other antidepressants, how they work really is not that they reduce the suffering of depression, but rather that they introduce a lot of noise to the brain, sort of like random activity.
That doesn't sound good.
Yeah. I mean, they do help a lot of people well, but how they work really is that they sort of introduce random activity or random like patterns that sort of break larger patterns of suffering. And once they break those patterns, then you no longer experience the suffering, but it also becomes harder to form sort of large scale patterns that give rise to happiness. And so a lot of people who take antidepressants experience this blunted feeling. I would just like, and I personally have felt this too, on mood stabilizers and antidepressants, is that it's just very blunt.
Yeah, I think some antipsychotics do as well, I think.
Yeah, antipsychotics, I think, function in a similar way. That's a good point.
Yeah, a friend of mine said she felt the same way, like it wasn't necessarily the case that negative valence went down. It was just like everything went down, was blunted, affective blunting. Oh, I wonder if that's if that's known in the medical community already, or if majority or a portion of doctors already know this but dispense them anyway, or is this still quite new research, I wonder?
I think that most doctors are aware that SSRIs and other antidepressants and antipsychotics don't work that well. They're like sort of have like a low success rate. For example, antidepressants, the first antidepressant diagnosed to a person with major depressive disorder only works 50% of the time. So it's essentially a shot. It's a shot in the dark. And also about 30% of people with major depressive disorder show essentially treatment-resistant depression, which means that
Yeah.
all of the treatments they've gotten have not worked. So I think that just shows like the dismal condition of psychiatry
Also, yeah.
and the dismal condition of neuroscience, that
Mm.
for like 30 years, we've had a continuous like pharmacological paradigm of like psychiatry, that what matters is that there's some sort of chemical imbalance in the brain.
Yeah.
I use quotation marks because
That old
it's not really real. Yeah, there's a chemical imbalance in the brain,
Yeah.
and the way to fix that is with drugs that resolve the imbalance. And that's not entirely wrong, but it's certainly not right either. And it misses so much of the picture that it becomes very difficult to treat. And the thing is, people have a lot of vested interest in maintaining this theory, like the entire pharmaceutical industry. They have a lot of vested interest in maintaining the pharmaceutical theory of mental illnesses, because they profit off of it an enormous amount. And the entire psychiatric, like the DSM-5 is largely written by people who are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies.
Yes.
So like the condition of psychiatry in general is something I'm very passionate about. And I think that one of the main applications of QRI stuff and QRI theories is to help us rethink psychiatry. And that's why like it's led to, for example, the idea that we need to advocate the use of psychedelics a lot more.
Yeah.
Psychedelics are remarkably effective at treating mental disorders. And like many of the most effective treatments, I think, and this is evidence-based, like for example, the best treatment for PTSD at the moment is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And it's the best treatment because it leads to the greatest rate of remission in PTSD symptoms. And for treatment-resistant depression, one of the best treatments is ketamine. And actually, ketamine works for me.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. So like, I just think that and not only that, but I think that like things like meditation and other like just other paradigms of treating mental illness need to be given their due, and they haven't yet by like the very dominant paradigm of the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmacological paradigm of mental disorder.
Yeah, I mean, you know what they say, a patient cured is a customer lost, I believe. But no, I'm with you there. So it is effective blunting similar to anhedonia then, or?
Yeah. I think affective blunting is similar to anhedonia. The main difference is that anhedonia doesn't necessarily blunt suffering.
Okay.
So affective blunting is sort of two-sided. It blunts both suffering and happiness, and it's induced by another. Like anhedonia is sort of natural, and that it's often just induced by depression or like natural sort of experiences, whereas affective blunting is usually experienced by something, or it's caused by something external to the brain. So like a drug. But yeah, I also found this research review that I did. It's very long, but yeah. So some evidence examples for the symmetry theory of valence are physical behaviors. So for example, meditation, breathing, and heart rate variability. So all of these found that the most symmetrical meditation, where you have very symmetrical breathing patterns and very like symmetrical patterns of those produce sort of the highest levels of valence, or like the most positive valence. And this is really evidence in the jhanas, like the people who do jhana meditation, which is one of the best ways to just induce happiness by just thinking, essentially through just meditation. At the highest level of jhana, and the most experienced jhana meditators have the most rhythmic patterns of activity in their EEG, the most symmetrical rhythmic patterns. This also shows for breathing. So like breathing at a resonant frequency of 6 breaths per minute, and like in a very symmetrical way produce the highest sort of happiness and like just very good experience. Like the most like suffering experiences, like fear and anxiety, those promote irregularity of breathing, like very irregular respiratory rate, irregular like amount of air inhaled. So essentially, these are just showing, again, symmetry seems to matter a lot. And the same thing for orgasm and massage and other like physical experiences, that one of the main theories of orgasm is that orgasm occurs through a sexual trance that occurs like via rhythmic entrainment, which is sort of just an entrainment to a process of rhythmic stimulation. And once the brain has like sort of fully entrained to that, it produces the experience of orgasm. And that is essentially a symmetry theory of valence for orgasm. That like what produces this very positive experience is just prolonged symmetry of a very particular kind.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are lots of other kinds of evidence for this, but I think that by the end of doing the research, I was convinced but still skeptical. Like I don't think it's clear that symmetry is the only thing that matters, but I think it matters a lot more than like most people think, and it matters a lot more than even a lot of neuroscientists think.
I wonder if symmetrical breathing works to a similar mechanism as music or dancing. I do find the term treatment-resistant depression remarkable because it sounds so final, despite new treatments being discovered, like neurofeedback. We're supposed to be on the cusp of things like the singularity and intelligence explosions. So something like treatment-resistant depression sounds very archaic to me.
It does sound archaic, but I think what it means really is that these people so far, like the treatments that they have done haven't worked, or like all available treatments don't work for them. And the thing is, like a lot of the truly like effective treatments and a lot of the more like cutting edge treatments are available to a vanishingly small proportion of depression. So how many people can really do ketamine therapy? How many people can really do biofeedback? How many people can get like deep brain stimulation? How many people can like get an electrode implanted in their brain to like reduce depression or like have a brain computer interface? That's like a tiny amount of patients. And so they do have treatment-resistant depression because the treatments that are available to them don't work.
Yeah, that is, I see. That's unfortunate, that is.
So I think an important aspect of this is that we don't just have to develop working treatments, we have to democratize access to those treatments.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. What do you think about microdosing? Or do you think trip doses are more effective than macrodosing, or macrodosing also has its place, do you think?
I don't have strong opinions. I don't think I've done enough research to have strong opinions on microdosing. I think that you do, like the theory of like psychedelics that I am sort of inclined to believe is also a QRI theory. And that theory is neural annealing. Right, the idea of neural annealing is that how psychedelics produce long-term change or just like change in the brain is that they break down these static sort of patterns of activity. And these static fixed models of the world that sort of become ossified or that become very concrete, they turn into these rigid models. And that produces suffering because, first of all, your brain has a very hard time predicting the world if it's not flexible enough to update and change in response to new information. And also, you can just get into this fixed pattern of activity that is very like pain-inducing. So you see this with depression patients. You can kind of see their like very fixed world model. And I personally know that like depression can be very delusional, where you just repeat these beliefs to yourself. And those beliefs are like enforced top down. You just like, for example, say like, I'm worthless or life is meaningless. And those beliefs don't update in response to new experience. And so one way that psychedelics can work is by breaking down those models and then making the brain essentially more flexible and more receptive to new information. And the idea of annealing is that in metal, it comes from like metal. And in metal, how annealing works is that when the metal is melted, all of the very strong chemical bonds between, for example, like the iron molecules break down.
Oh, that's a good metaphor.
Or the iron atoms, I mean, or like the molecules that make up the metal, those all break down. And then it allows the metal to essentially like form a more stable pattern. So for example, like the reason why melting down a sword and then reforging it again and again makes the sword stronger over time is that essentially there will be like warped patterns of bonds in the metal that make the metal weaker, because the strongest configuration of molecules is the one that is the most stable, and the one where each molecule is just like sort of connected to an equal amount of other molecules. This is not very good physics, but like
I got a good picture. Yeah.
So like if you imagine the metal, it sort of makes intuitive sense that like if you keep melting it down and reforging it, that eventually it would get to a more stable state and the sword would get stronger.
Yeah.
So the same thing happens with the brain, is that psychedelics sort of melt out a lot of patterns, and that leads to a sort of massive update.
Yeah.
And so that leads the brain to essentially reach a lower energy state that's more stable. And that produces like long-term change. It makes it easier to form new habits. It makes it easier to update your information, like your beliefs. And it can just generally like produce a lot of positive change. So that's the theory of like the mechanism of psychedelics. But I think aside from the mechanism, so regardless of how they work, it does seem very clear that they do work, like that they do produce really positive results for a wide variety of mental ailments.
Anecdotally as well, lots of trippers would say the same. I wonder if that could be why you can feel so reborn after psychedelic trips, and why the world looks awesome again when you during it and afterwards. Everything feels like been reborn, or everything is new and shiny again. You get more inspiration. I imagined like a blacksmith or a glass blower when you were describing that. But yeah, intrusive thoughts are an unfortunate effect of depression, and it just creates learned helplessness. And I think something similar happens when you break a bone. I think it knits together again, and the bone becomes stronger. But yeah, with like pain and pleasure, it gets filtered through quite a few complications. Like so you've got pain and pleasure, and then you've got noble pains like self-sacrifice, and evil pleasures like Schadenfreude, and then it can get nuanced again. You say like an evil person inflicts no suffering, but instead inflicts pleasures onto people in order to control them and keep them oppressed, like a Huxleyan way, like Soma or Brave New World. And I wonder how accurate is the word evil in describing such a person when that person has not caused any pain or suffering onto others, nor are they relishing any Schadenfreude, even arguably, yes, engineering a once-free population into an easily controllable, lotus-eating hedonists. I would say makes one evil. Do you think the problem with evil is addressed enough with it, something abolitionism or not?
That's a great question, and that's a great series of like a really interesting series of concerns you bring up. I think that those complications around pain and pleasure that you brought up about like it's not clear that all kinds of pain are bad, and it's not clear that all kinds of pleasure are good. Certainly intuitively, I don't think that human intuition should necessarily be like the only arbiter of like the moral truth, or like
Absolutely.
Our intuition shouldn't necessarily decide what the moral truth is. But I also think that they are like humanity is the only species capable of attributing value to things that we know of, that we are aware of. And so like, anyway, I think that freedom is a really important quality that pretty much every agent would necessarily care about. Its ability to be an agent in the future, to continue to make choices. And I think that very often, like maximizing for a quality of experience will reduce freedom. And I don't think that necessarily more freedom will produce more happiness. But I think that freedom might be an important axis of value that matters independently of the pain pleasure axis. I don't think that the only reason we value freedom is because it makes us happier on average.
Good point.
This is something that like Dostoevsky talks about a lot, and the other existentialists and like Nietzsche, they talk a lot about how like, even if I had the option to live in this like crystal palace they called it the Crystal Palace because there was this thought experiment similar to like, it was just an idealistic utopia about how like in the future we'll have all these machines and technological devices and they'll be able to like make you so happy. They'll like tell you exactly what to do at exactly what time of day. This is in like the 1800s. They were imagining this. So it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like someone's phone telling them, like, I know there's like a watch now, I think it's called Oura or something, that can like tell you, oh, it's time for you to rest. It's time for you to like take a run. It's time for you to do some work. It's time for you to sleep.
Okay.
Right. So like that, it's sort of, it doesn't necessarily force you to do anything, but it sort of is a constraint on your freedom because your actions will be dictated by a device external from your own mind. And it's meant to like optimize your happiness or your health, right? I think that's like very, very likely the best way to produce the maximum amount of happiness would be to eliminate a lot of positive human experience. But I mean, to eliminate a lot of freedom. But I think that like freedom is independently valuable, right?
Yeah. Sounds like a cyberpunk nanny state a little bit. We watch is nagging you to do stuff, and yeah, humanity is the only species who can attribute value to things and also rescue other life forms from suffering.
Right.
So, if we go, then maybe they have to wait another few billion years to get liberated from the Darwinian abyss. But yeah, this is also why I'm concerned with things like the Internet of Things and everything having a chip in your clothes, in your own head, in every household item like your fridge or your washing machine. Because people will be able to quantify you. You'll be able to quantify yourself, but also people in the government will be able to quantify you better than you can quantify yourself, and that's something that does make me quite nervous.
I think it is like a challenging. I think that this is just another example, but there are so many challenging thought experiments for humanism and just challenging paradoxes. One of them, another is that like I think the most straightforward technological path to like improve happiness for most of the human population right now be to install brain-computer interface in everyone. I think that brain-computer interface technology is developing very rapidly, and that already it's at a point where we could potentially like modulate brain activity using like a neurostimulator and a brain-computer interface that reads your brain activity and then just inputs new electrical stimulation to areas of the brain in order to break up patterns of depression and to introduce patterns of like higher valence. I think that's possible within the next 10 years and will probably happen within the next 10 years as a treatment for depression. It's already sort of happened in labs already, but I think it'll be like mass available. And I think that the main problem with this, the ethical problem, is that it's very clearly agency undermining. It undermines your agency, it undermines your freedom, because you have a device outside of you that you really don't understand. It uses a neural network that is like, you don't understand the neural network weights. You can't possibly understand how it works. You can't possibly understand how it decides to like put electrical stimulation in your brain. You don't really have any agency over it. It's separate from you. It's produced by a corporation, very likely, that you have no control over. And so like, it's very clearly freedom undermining, but it will maximize happiness. And so like, for someone who believes in the hedonistic imperative, I think you're obligated to see that as a moral good, but I think that I don't think it would be a moral good. And maybe you could justify that in terms of suffering even. Like you could say that when most of the human population has no freedom, in a long term that will lead to more suffering, even if in the short term it will produce happiness. But I think it's plausible that like we could live in a world where everyone is living sort of in information sensitive grades of bliss, but have no agency and not exist as an agent.
Agency bliss. Yeah. Do you think Neuralink could be the one that will take us into this new age? This Neuralink isn't I think that's made a few people concerned, really. But yeah, I think agency is super important too. But I do. Obviously, there are the obvious concerns with Neuralink, but I've often thought about Neuralink's potential for exploring new states of consciousness, like with like psychedelics or substances in general. If Neuralink could open a new inspire a new wave of psychonautics, I wonder if it's not used like it could be used in China, maybe, perhaps.
Yeah. No, I think that I want to be excited about brain-computer interfaces.
Me too.
Because I think that they do open up so many like incredible like ways to explore consciousness and to change the brain. And I just think that under the conditions of the world right now, they will likely be produced in a way that undermines freedom and is like serve the interests of essentially like the ruling class or those in power or those who produce them. And I think that Neuralink is not the most advanced BCI currently. It's not really like at the forefront.
Okay.
It just has a lot of media attention on it.
Right. Yeah.
Of Elon, partially. And it is like, it's not like super behind. It's just like, they're not really like the center of R&D.
Cutting edge.
They're not exactly cutting edge. And I think they're also farther away from their goals than is claimed by. Classically, they're much farther behind than Elon and like the media in general claims. But yeah, I think that like the exciting thing is when you have a brain-computer interface, you can have much more targeted interventions. So like, first of all, it means that people with like locked-in syndrome or paralysis, like people with locked-in syndrome, are incapable of any voluntary movement whatsoever, but they're conscious. So like they are locked in their bodies, unable to move their eyes, their mouth, or nothing. And a brain-computer interface gives them the ability to have agency for the first time ever. So like that is clearly like an amazing, and it's pretty much the only way to do it. Like they have no other way to, like, because if the only thing they can really control is their brain activity, then the only way for them to exercise agency on the world is for their brain activity to be read by a device. And
that never occurred to me.
Yeah. So that's a small population of people, but it's a population of people who experience extraordinary suffering. So similar to cluster headaches, maybe we should focus a lot of research on them because they experience extraordinary suffering and extraordinary unfreedom, like like just lying there conscious but unable to do anything. So I think that BCIs are exciting in that way. They're also exciting in that they could augment human abilities pretty dramatically. Like if you have a brain-computer interface that allows you to control prosthetic limbs, that could allow you to control a computer directly, to translate your thoughts or your imaginings directly into renderings. I think one really exciting possibility is that like you could imagine a design or an artwork, and that would immediately be translated into reality, into some like artifact. And I think that's already possible. I think with like the combination of like, if we combined current BCI technology with DALL-E 2, which is like a very advanced current like image generation algorithm that uses text prompts, but we replace the text prompts with instead of patterns of neural activity, we could pretty easily translate patterns of neural activity into at least some image. And I don't think it would be close to perfect, but the point is that there are a lot of exciting possibilities. And then when you add also in not just a BCI, but also a neurotransmit, like a neurostimulator that can stimulate brain activity at the same time as it's reading brain activity, then you could have like a psychedelic BCI. So for example, like a brain-computer interface that stimulates the brain in a way that produces psychedelic experience or just very altered states of consciousness. And you could do that in such a targeted way that, like, the problem with pharmaceutical psychedelics is that you don't really have control once you've taken the pharmaceutical, like once you've taken the thing. So like, absolutely. I mean, how like LSD works is that it activates serotonin receptors for a very prolonged period, and that produces a serotonergic psychedelic experience. but you can't like go into the brain and you'd have to take out every LSD molecule that's in a serotonin receptor in order to stop the experience. And so instead of doing that, you have to wait 12 hours. But with a BCI, you could just create the psychedelic experience more directly by activating the brain in a way that produces psychedelic experiences. And then you could stop whenever you wanted. I think that's a very technically difficult thing to do. Like, I think that is not close. Like, that is an order of magnitude more difficult than like translating motor commands into commands for a prosthetic. That's like, it's much, much harder to create psychedelic experiences with a BCI. But I think within maybe 20 years, that'll happen. 20 to 30 years, it'll be possible. Maybe faster, I don't know.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Yeah, I'm very claustrophobic, so something like locked-in syndrome or paralysis is up there among my worst nightmares, really. BCIs. In terms of intelligence, they're promising. Hopefully, they can enhance human intelligence because nowadays, I think it's probably a bit more difficult to be a polymath. Each field of science and engineering and endeavor has so much info packed into each one, no matter how specialized it is, like immuno-neuropsychology or something. Each field of study is so packed with information after decades and centuries of scientific inquiry. It's you probably need technological intelligence enhancement to be able to calculate things more quickly, cross-pollinating to find novel solutions to problems. So maybe that could be the way forward in terms of suffering abolition.
I think that there is like, first of all, you're right that like all fields of study and like development are much more complex than they've ever been, and there's very little low-hanging fruit left for the most part, and it requires like a huge amount of research to get to the point where you can like move the boundary of science a little bit farther out, and that's why like it requires a PhD, and that PhD has to be hyper specialized. And so I think that if we had things that could dramatically augment our ability to recognize patterns and make progress, and I think the best way to do that is to leverage like computational resources, but the brain is too disconnected from those resources at the moment. So like a computer, like it's kind of surreal to me that like the only way that we interface with computation is through our hands. So like we treat computers like we've treated every other tool for like literally millennia. And I think that will not be the case within like by the middle of this century. I think the primary way that people interface with computation will be neural activity. And I also think that's good, both because it would allow a lot more progress and allow us to like essentially reduce suffering and like prevent crises potentially, just because we understand the world better and are able to make a lot of progress on important research. But I also think it's important because it sort of mitigates artificial intelligence risk. It mitigates the alignment problem, and it mitigates the risk of the singularity. And it does that because it means that if humans are connected to computation fundamentally, and we are part of the singularity. So like if the artificial intelligence system becomes artificially intelligent because it's integrated with humans, then it's much more difficult for the system to optimize us away or get rid of us. And so instead of like humans developing this device or this computational system that becomes far more intelligent than us, that we don't really have control over it doesn't have the same values as us, and it eventually either works against our values or eliminates us entirely. Instead, we are part of the computational system. And the computational system can't function without us. So I think that's really the way that we should try to make it happen, is to keep humans in the loop. If humans are in the loop, then our values will continue to matter, at least to some degree, regardless of how AI occurs.
That's good thinking. It's we have to find a kind of balanced Goldilocks spot where artificial intelligence is useful for us, but we are also useful for the artificial intelligence in
right. That's exactly how
its best life. Yeah.
That's a great phrase. Yeah. Yeah. Really, we need to keep artificial intelligence useful for us, but also keep us useful for the artificial intelligence. Absolutely. That's a great phrase. Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't. Yeah. One way not to be destroyed, I hope. But yeah, and BCIs also have potential to be. Obviously, it's technically quite difficult, but BCIs could be. Have more potential in being more empathic or empathogenic than MDMA even, which might, which is obviously very reliable, but perhaps BCIs could even be safer than MDMA as well being more empathogenic after enough generations and enough updates and upgrades. We are still. Well, I think we're leaving behind the dark age of psychedelia. I mean, in terms of like trip control, I suppose you've got things like benzos where you feel anxious, and psychotics if you want the trip to just stop. But I don't. That's always like a something saved as a last resort, I reckon. And this might be a bit controversial, but about BCIs for animals. What do you think about? I suppose there's uplifting where you want to enhance their intelligence, and there's also for one application, another application for studies in animal cognition. It could be the answer to a question such as do they suffer? Obviously, I think they do. Do animals suffer? Not everybody does. Some Thai cultures don't believe they're actual real living things. Do they suffer? Are they intelligent as us, but in a different kind of qualitative way? Sorry. So maybe it could answer these these questions about animal cognition, I suppose. Then is that? Do you think that would be the way forward?
I think that would be really interesting, and we should definitely do it. We should definitely do research on that. I think one example that brings to mind is like a lot of BCIs are essentially a brain scanning device. That's something that translates the brain activity into an intention or a command, and then some action effector. And a very common action effector, or thing that just like takes out actions based on the brain activity, is a speech synthesizer. And there are a lot of very intelligent animals who cannot speak, but the question of why they can't speak is, it's unclear if it's their brains are too limited, or if we either can't comprehend the kind of speech that they produce, or they don't have the like physical mechanism to produce the kinds of syllables that we interpret as language. An example are like whales, dolphins, parrots, even
octopi.
Octopi. Parrots are a good example of a species that can produce human-like speech, but it's not language exactly, because it's not completely compositional, and like they don't produce novel sentences mostly.
Okay.
But I think that parrots are not the most intelligent animal, and a lot of the more intelligent animals are unable to produce speech in that way. So like one example of interesting research you could do is put a BCI on a dolphin, for example, and see what comes out of the speech. Like, could they produce? I mean, obviously, whatever, it would be similar to. Have you seen the movie? What's it called? Like Landing. It's where aliens land. Oh, Contact. Is it called Contact?
Oh, with yes.
Right, and then they have to communicate with them, and the aliens have like the circular language. What's it called?
Jodie Foster's in it, isn't she? I was trying to remember the name. Jodie Foster, actress. Yeah.
But yeah, it would be something like that, where we would have to do linguistics on like whatever comes out of the dolphin speech synthesizer. Obviously, would not be human language. It would not be human language, but we could still analyze it and see if it has linguistic structure to determine if they have language or not. Of course, we'd also have to determine lots of other things, like what the dolphin's like language area of the brain is, and lots of other stuff. But I think, anyway, to go out of the weeds a little bit, like the question you asked about animals more generally is really important, and I wanted to talk about animals for the last part of this.
Yeah.
I think like the question of animal ethics is really fundamental, because it's often like, first of all, it's often used as a way for people to like attribute moral value to things. They contrast humans to animals to attribute moral value to humans.
Oh yeah.
And like historically, it's like people have often like disregarded people as morally valuable by comparing them to animals.
Yeah.
So this is true for like centuries.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, like even Immanuel Kant, who's like often seen as like the core moral theorist of the West, he said that Black people and Indigenous people should not be considered morally relevant because they're more analogous to animals than to humans. But I think this like this moral dichotomy between humans and animals is a dichotomy that has produced like a huge amount of suffering.
Absolutely.
Like, it's kind of just a mind virus. There should not be a like strict dichotomy of like humans are fundamentally infinitely morally valuable and all animals have no moral value whatsoever. That's kind of insane to me.
And me.
And I think it's also insane just because if you look at the empirical evidence, first of all, it's very clear that all of our experiences are produced by the brain. And our experiences of like morality, like our concepts, like our moral decision making, our attributions of value, our experiences of suffering and happiness, those are all produced by the brain. And the brains of animals are not far enough away from us to justify the belief that they don't have any kind of similar experience. Just based on the similarity of brain structure alone, you can say that certainly primates, they experience suffering. So like I don't think it's disputable that, and they experience like complicated suffering. They experience social suffering as well. Like animals experience suffering from rejection. Animals can experience grief. Like dolphins will mourn their lost. Elephants will mourn their lost siblings or their lost children. And they have like complex social structure. They have like linguistic communication. They have motivations. They have like experiences of joy. Like I think it's just kind of absurd to treat animals as morally irrelevant. But I don't think that's what we're arguing here. I think the question of animal ethics, which is just like the whole like study of like how do we deal with animals ethically. I think like the thing that I guess you're involved with is trying to herbivorize predators, right?
Yeah, as per the name. Yeah.
So do you want to give, I guess, your argument for why that is a moral priority or why that's something that should happen?
Well, I think liberation from suffering is the attractor that humans work towards. If we don't eliminate suffering completely, I think it is still a worthy goal to at least aim for and to try and make progress in. And I think it's simply a case of, we look through an empathic lens. We know that suffering is inherently disvaluable, and we are one thing. We are the only species who can help lift non-humans and animals out of the abyss of suffering. And I think there's so much suffering and there's so much needless suffering that I think it's imperative that we just try. I mean, we sometimes treat animals worse than animals treat each other, and it just it seems like we go like we're stuck in some sorrow. We go round and round in circles, and I think working to liberate ourselves and animals and every living thing from suffering, liberate them all from suffering, is something that should that we should strive for, that we should use as a kind of attractor in the future to work towards.
Yeah.
So I think for me, it's a very visceral. It's a very kind of visceral reason behind it. I just hate suffering. I mean, obviously it's useful, but in fight or flight situations. But there are plenty of situations where one can do neither, so they're suffering needlessly. And I think interventions to liberate, the whole living world from suffering is something that needs to happen if we are to break out of this kind of samsaric cycle, if you like. And yeah, does that make sense? Does that sound like convincing to you?
Yeah, I think that's a good argument, and I also think that David's arguments for this make sense, but I also think it's the area of his thought that is most vulnerable and most flawed to me. It is just where it seems to be like it is a logical conclusion of his theory, but I think it sort of also exposes the limits of the hedonistic imperative. Because, and so here are some lines of like critique that I would go for on this.
Absolutely.
So I think if like to steelman the argument, I think first of all, predators and other like animals produce a huge amount of suffering. Like you can see like a tiger devour a deer, and that does not look happy. I'm sure that animal does experience an extraordinary amount of suffering, certainly in its death. But here are some responses I would give. First of all, I don't think this is a moral priority whatsoever. I think that if you rank like the causes of like the most suffering, first of all, I think that human suffering is far worse than animal suffering on average. Yeah. And in general, not just on average, but definitely. Humans are a far more complex creature that experiences suffering more viscerally and more extremely. And I think that there's also likely a logarithmic progression in the complexity of an information system and the amount of suffering or valence it can experience. And what I mean by that is that, so let's say like imagine a graph, and like this axis here is the amount of valence the creature or information system can experience, including both suffering and joy. And then here, the x-axis is how complicated the information system is. So for example, how many neurons are in it. I don't think it's a linear, like the more neurons you have, the more suffering and pain you experience, and the more suffering and joy you experience. I think it's rather very logarithmic. So like once you reach like, let's say, I don't know, 10,000 neurons, like that's a lot of, like you can definitely experience pain and pleasure. But I think that there's a certain point where once you develop like a complicated prefrontal cortex and like consciousness essentially, that it skyrockets. And so it's similar to like graphs of the Industrial Revolution and like the population. It's like very logarithmic, and there are a lot of creatures that don't like experience orders of magnitude less conscious experience in general and valence in general than humans do. So I think that there's a very strong argument that like there are billions of humans who are starving and suffering extraordinary pain right now. Why would we try to do this extraordinary, complicated and expensive and resource intensive project of herbivorizing predators, which is not even clear how possible that is or how feasible or how it could work, when there are very clear feasible ways to reduce suffering for humans. So that's one argument, is that it's just not a moral priority. Even if you expand it to animals, I don't think that like wild animals suffering violent deaths from predators is a moral priority even in the animal kingdom. Like I think that the amount of like factory farming like is literally like billions of animals are being tortured on the daily.
Absolutely.
So that like just like eliminating like extreme violent factory farming would be a better moral priority, especially considering like pigs, for example, are a very complicated animal that has a lot of like, can definitely experience suffering and pleasure. So like, I just don't think it's a moral priority. So that's one argument. Another argument is that it seems very anthropomorphic.
Right. Yeah.
So like, if you could imagine, there's this short story by Yudkowsky actually, where he talks about humans meeting aliens in space, and these aliens have very different moral systems, and the aliens essentially say, maybe you read this, but I think it's called A Meeting of Three Worlds or something.
Yeah.
But one of these aliens are like the baby eaters, and they eat babies. They experience pleasure from eating babies. And it's just part of their culture. And then one of these creatures like sees, I think it's some aspect of human activity. I don't remember what it was. I think it might be, I don't know. Maybe it was sex. Essentially, they just see it as like a moral atrocity. Like they see some basic aspect of human activity as a moral atrocity. And they like essentially see the humans the way we see the baby eaters. So like we see the baby eaters as atrocious because they're eating their own babies. And the baby eaters in turn see it as not a problem whatsoever. And then these other creatures see our activity, like, for example, our sexual activity, as a moral atrocity, but we see it as entirely normal. I think that a tiger certainly doesn't evaluate its activity as negative. And I don't even think that, like, I think it's very anthropomorphic. And like in the same way that we would object to these creatures coming to Earth and like eliminating all human sexual activity because they see it as a moral atrocity, I think that's very similar to like a tiger's objection, but they don't have the ability to object. And I think that also like this naturally leads to the conclusion that like if we should like eliminate suffering for wild animals by herbivorizing the predators, shouldn't we also raise all animals to the level of human consciousness and essentially turn everyone into humans so they can experience extraordinary pleasure as well? I think it just leads to the conclusion of like, oh, so we're just turning everything into a monoculture of like a single kind of consciousness. I also don't think it's like biologically plausible. I think that
maybe,
I think that ecosystems function through predation of some kind, and it's actually like almost like a logical consequence of having trophic levels. Like, so at the most basic trophic level, or like level of energy that produces the most energy, are plants. They produce the most energy on the planet. But the thing is, when you have an organism that produces that energy and it's very simple, then maybe you should say that the moral obligation is that everyone should just consume the most basic trophic level because they are the least likely to experience pleasure and pain. So that's like an argument for like human veganism and even animal veganism. Because, and I think that's plausible, but the thing is like if everything on the planet did that, then there would be, first of all, much less of that. And it also is like, there's a natural tendency for, if you can get energy in a more like efficient way, or if you can get it in a different way without just harvesting the most basic trophic level, then that will develop. And evolutionary Nietzsche will develop for that. So like the reason why animals develop is because like essentially plants started developing in a way, or like bacteria, for example, started developing in a way where like eating other plants was an effective way to get energy. And eventually like they diverged and they became animals, and those animals started eating plants. But then again, it diverged where they realized that another effective way to get energy was to eat other animals. So I think that this is sort of a natural consequence of just how biology works and how like trophic levels work. And I think to avoid that, you'd have to do a lot of like command economy. Essentially, it would have to be a command economy of the environment, where like essentially you'd have this like moral committee that decides like, is it acceptable that tigers eat deer or something? Or like, and I think that command economy where like we command how energy is consumed or distributed in the biosphere is just not feasible and not something that we should even try to accomplish. So I'm pretty anti. I just think it's not like, I think it's a very irrelevant sphere of like an irrelevant pursuit to try to herbivorize predators, and I don't think it's desirable either.
So would you say something like a command economy and compassionate stewardship are like vastly different, and no matter what our best intentions are, it'll always be a kind of like a flawed, morally questionable command economy rather than compassionate stewardship?
I think compassionate stewardship is a rhetorical flourish that helps to obscure how it actually will function necessarily.
Okay.
Like, I mean, by compassionate stewardship, do you mean that we are compassionate to the tigers by like herbivorizing them and fundamentally changing their species so that they are no longer the same being in order to protect the suffering of the deer, who we also have compassionate stewardship for? And like, let's say that will definitely produce unintended consequences. One of the unintended consequences that's like will be very clear is that, you know, predators help to maintain the population of herbivores, and herbivores don't have natural population control measures, and they've evolved in tandem with predators. And so in order to maintain healthy, like sustainable populations of any herbivore, it requires predation. And this is very clear. Like ecologically, a lot of ecosystems collapse because there aren't enough predators. The herbivores get out of control, and the herbivores destroy the plant population that sustains the entire ecosystem. So like, in order to resolve that unintended consequence, we have to also manage the herbivore population. And so I think that it would lead to this sort of command creep, where as we would go in with one like compassionate stewardship thing, like let's say we like, I don't know, herbivorized all like the Bengal tigers so that they eat plants. I think that would lead to unintended consequences, and in order to manage the unintended consequences, we'd have to dramatically expand the scope of the intervention. And then once we expanded the scope of the intervention, that would lead to more unintended consequences. And that just leads to mission creep, where eventually we're managing the entire biosphere and have transformed it entirely and in ways that we did not intend to, but where that was sort of natural logical consequences of this like misguided initial like compassionate stewardship intervention.
I think it does, especially like with predators, and it does raise the kind of ship of Theseus problem, or the Star Trek transporter thought experiment, where, you know, some change happens and you start to question, is it the same thing as it was before? Is it now something different?
Right. Yeah. I mean, what makes us think that we have the right to fundamentally change other species in the biosphere? Like, because you could say that we have the right because we're more intelligent and more powerful. So essentially like the right of power or the right of intelligence. But then that raises issues when it comes to artificial intelligence, because that means that if we develop a artificial system that is more intelligent and powerful than us, does that give them the right to intervene in the human sphere entirely and decide if they want to make compassionate interventions that are very like, I would not imagine that an artificial intelligence system would have very similar values to us. So like, let's say it has a value just on computational power. I think that's plausible that like AI would value just the sheer amount of computational power or like energetic resources devoted to increasing computation. That's not really a human value, but let's say it thought that whenever humans unplugged a computer or destroyed a database, that was a moral atrocity. And it started saying that humans, like it started reprogramming humans, that we were incapable of destroying databases and destroying like information. Like we no longer have the ability to erase things. And it could conceive this like erasing of information as similar to how we see predation, as like, I just think that like enforcing our moral values, which we aren't even certain of, in sort of misguided and practically infeasible ways onto the biosphere is just not something we should engage in.
It does mirror the thought experiment of the singularity intervening to do to us against our scope of intelligence and free will, even like what we would do if we were to intervene and to prevent animal suffering. I suppose even if you'd ask lots of other futurists and transhumanists, or would you want the singularity to come and sweep you away into something that you can't conceive of yet? A portion of them would say no. So that is it's a minefield, tricky one, definitely. I think to to answer your question a bit more, I think for me, I'm a very kind of sensitive and empathic personality type. So, and I think I might have some kind of mirror synesthesia thing going on. So, if I see like suffering on television or on the internet, it affects me quite viscerally. And
yeah,
I suppose it's the kind of logical conclusion, a spiral. Like, say to people, for discussing animal cruelty, I would say to people, treat them well, no matter how skeptical one is about how sentient or sapient they are, just in case if you think animals don't feel much pain, but in case you're wrong, then we should probably act as if they could still be, as if the likelihood is still there. I suppose it's like a logical conclusion of that, do it because we could be wrong and we could be mistaken that they are not a moral priority. And if we're wrong, then
humanity's already been so wrong about so many things, not just scientifically but morally. Like, we already, like, huge swaths of the human population regarded huge swaths of other parts of the human population as morally irrelevant for centuries. In fact, for most of human history, like, most human people haven't really believed in this like moral universalism that many people believe in now, that all humans are equally valuable. It's kind of a new development in human history. And so, like, if you could install the idea that, like, you should treat every human and every animal as like morally valuable, just in case they do experience suffering and pleasure and do have like conscious experience similar to your own, then that would lead to a lot of like a much better history. Like, in the same way that like enslaved people were treated as like morally irrelevant, I think that that's similar to the logic that's used to justify a lot of animal suffering today. I don't think it's exactly analogous, and I think that you can go very wrong making that analogy. But yeah, I think it's a big problem, and that like we should have a default of assume that whatever you're dealing with can suffer, and assume that you should try to reduce its suffering.
There's quite an interesting idea in Christianity as well. Something bad or evil or suffering exists. It gives a person a chance to do good. I think in Latin it's something like Felix Culpa. And again, it's a kind of like visualizing history as cyclic and just grinding on and on and on, and maybe solving the problem of wild animal suffering would be one of the ways to break out, and then we spread or do rescue missions to other systems and then other universes. But I could be wrong, absolutely, and I could, if we looked at the other way, we could be causing more unforeseen circumstances, no matter how good one's intentions are.
I think that's possible too. I have to wrap it up.
Okay, no problem. Let me see. I think we've done about an hour and a half, haven't we?
Yeah, but it was a great conversation.
It was.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to meet you and finally get to chat with you. And we'll get it up on. Did you want anything edited out, or do you think that's all right?
I think it's all good. Yeah, you can leave it all in.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks again for doing the interview again. It was a pleasure to meet you, and I really enjoyed that. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
See you later.
See you, Adam.